Privileged to welcome you all here today for this special event. We are particularly delighted to be joined by the Honourable Minister Ingrid Stitt, Minister for Mental Health, Ageing and Multicultural Affairs. We're really delighted that you're with us this morning. Before we commence the lecture, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting this morning, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and we extend that respect to anyone who's joining us online or in person today from an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander background. So please note that today's event will be live streamed and recorded. The exits are located at the front and rear of the auditorium, and should you need the bathrooms, they're located at the top of the foyer, just beyond the stairs and the ramp. So today's lecture is devoted to mental health. Mental illness directly or indirectly affects us all. And it's through the combination of an improved understanding of the molecular underpinnings of mental illness, together with increased awareness of individual needs and improved treatment options, that we can make major strides forward for better mental health for all. So today we'll focus on an area of particular significance, and that is women's mental health, with an emphasis on the relationship between stress and addiction. So we're honoured that Minister Stitt has kindly agreed to make some remarks to open the lecture. Minister Stitt has served as Minister for Mental Health since October 2023, and she and her team have been tireless advocates for improved mental health care in our state. She's been a champion of efforts to tackle alcohol and other drug use disorders. Over the past 2 years, Minister Stitt has visited the Florey on several occasions, and she's been a very enthusiastic participant in regular briefings from leading Florey mental health researchers, several of whom are with us here today. So, Minister, we're delighted that you're leading the charge to improve mental health care in the great state of Victoria, and we're thrilled to welcome you to make some opening remarks. Please put your hands together for the Minister.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that lovely warm welcome. And can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on this morning, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge any First Nations people joining us today. I'd also like to warmly welcome people here with lived and living experiences. I want to thank you particularly for working in partnership with the Victorian Government to achieve system transformation and a stronger mental health and wellbeing system for all Victorians. And Peter, thank you for that lovely introduction, and I do want to just acknowledge the incredible team here at the Florey, the very clever people, I like to call them, who are doing incredible world-leading research here at the Florey. I'd also like to acknowledge all of our speakers who we will hear from today. We've got a fantastic lineup, and I'm sure a very interesting lecture ahead. It's a real pleasure to be able to join you for this lecture today, and of course the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health, thank you for inviting me to also share this morning's event. As many of you will agree, the Florey has been at the forefront of brain and mental health research for more than 5 decades, driven by curiosity for what makes us tick. That's my kind of layperson's way of kind of articulating what it is the Florey do here. You're leading research priorities across some of our biggest brain challenges. And in particular, your contribution to research and care in women's mental health is outstanding. And today's lecture series carries that contribution further with a focus on women's mental health, particularly the intersection of stress and addiction. Thank you for the work that you do each and every day to challenge our understanding of the human brain and drive the development of new therapies and medical treatments. As every woman in this room knows, for far too long women's health has been undervalued, under-researched and underfunded. And our understanding of what it means to be healthy and what support is needed when you are unwell has been shaped by the experiences and physicality mostly of men. Women's experiences have been for too long overlooked, misdiagnosed and dismissed. And it's only with the fierce advocacy of women that our society is starting to recognise that women face very different health challenges. In the mental health space, there's a growing understanding that women and men experience stress and addiction very differently. There's now recognition of the impact of the burden of the mental load, the pressure of caregiving, and the weight of trying to be a good woman. In many ways, I think it's not surprising that we're seeing increased alcohol consumption amongst women, with many turning to alcohol as a stress reliever. But these pressures are also likely to prevent women from seeking help for addiction. Perhaps they feel that they're making a fuss. Perhaps they feel that they've failed and don't deserve support. And we only know that individuals living with substance use or addiction may experience co-occurring mental illness or experience significant trauma, including sexual abuse. Our responses to these challenges need to focus on embedding integrated treatment, care and support across the whole system. That is responsive to the specific and individual needs of women. And Victoria has a proud track record of working to improve women's health outcomes, including through our recent landmark inquiry into women's pain, for example. There's a power of work that's underway to ensure women in Victoria can access safe, compassionate and tailored mental health support when they need it. And of course, the Royal Commission into Victoria's mental health system highlighted the importance of ensuring services respond to the unique mental health and wellbeing needs of women. And that's why the Allan Labor government is transforming our system to ensure that women can access the support that they need when they need it. We know that individuals living with substance use or addiction may experience co-occurring mental illness, and we're focused on embedding integrated treatment, care and support across the system. Our statewide service, the Hamilton Centre, provides specialist clinical services and workforce training to improve outcomes for people with co-occurring conditions. And our government is making sure that there are supports and services that meet women where they're at and help maintain connection with family and community, which we know is so vital for healing. We're also developing, as has been mentioned, our first statewide alcohol and other drugs strategy to set the direction for the next decade. Our work on the strategy has included consultation with women to understand their experiences of substance use and barriers to accessing AOD services and support. In addition, last year, following a $100 million investment, we opened the first public specialist women's mental health service in Victoria. And that's a service that's operated in partnership between Alfred Health, Ramsay Health Care and Goulburn Valley Health. The Women's Recovery Network provides inclusive care for those who have experienced trauma and sexual abuse, and women presenting with eating disorders and women experiencing perinatal mental health concerns. We've also delivered the first Women's Prevention and Recovery Care Centre in Victoria to provide accommodation for women to stay with their children and remain connected to their family. The Royal Commission also highlighted that eating disorder presentations and severity have significantly increased in Victoria over the past decade. And of course, that is not an issue unique to Victoria. That is an issue right across the country and indeed globally. That's why our government has led the development of the Victorian Eating Disorder Strategy, and the first of a series of implementation plans which seeks to deliver a whole of government and whole of community approach. This is backed by a $31 million investment through the 24-25 state budget to increase access to effective and evidence-based treatment, care and support for Victorians with an eating disorder. And I'm excited that our first public funded residential eating disorder treatment centre is now open in Victoria. Our government really remains absolutely committed to improving women's mental health and wellbeing, and I'm very proud to be part of a government that's putting women's voices at the heart of that reform, and has committed to transforming our approach to mental health and AOD treatment, care and support. I know we can't do that without the incredible research power of places like the Florey, so it is a partnership that I think we need to really foster and cherish moving forward. I'm really encouraged by the wealth of knowledge and skills in our mental health and our AOD sectors, and I want to again congratulate the Florey for leading this conversation today and thank in advance the wonderful speakers that we will hear from shortly. Thank you so much again for having me along this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister, for those opening remarks. You have certainly touched on some incredible points that we'll dive into a little bit today, as well as acknowledge the enormous work that the Victorian Government is doing in reshaping this landscape. So good morning, everyone, to the Honourable Minister Stitt, to colleagues, to researchers, to carers, family members, advocates and those with lived and living experience of mental ill health. It's really wonderful to have you all here for this special event to shed light on women's health and addiction. My name is Jess Nithyanantharajah. I am the Head of Mental Health Research here at the Florey Institute, and today I have the great pleasure of being your host for this event. Now, as many of you may know, October is Mental Health Awareness Month, and Friday the 10th is Mental Health Awareness Day. That's 1 month in 12, 1 day in 365. And it does make a difference. Increasing awareness is important for reducing stigma and stereotypes of those living with complex mental health conditions. But we know that awareness alone is not enough. Research into identifying the root causes and the drivers of mental ill health, how external environmental factors interact with our unique internal biology, is critical for transforming how we understand, diagnose, treat and actually prevent chronic mental health conditions. And that is exactly what Florey researchers are driven to tackle. Mental health research at the Florey is focused around 3 central pillars, that being substance use and addiction. Oh, sorry, I'll just go to the next one. Schizophrenia and psychosis, and mood disorders. These are debilitating conditions that significantly impact the lives of many worldwide. And Florey mental health research really seeks to drive discovery, to accelerate understanding of how the brain is impacted by mental health conditions, to build new knowledge of the biological drivers, and to drive that discovery into translational and societal impact, to identify and develop new therapies to be able to improve the quality and the number of treatments that we have available for people. So today we'll dive into that first pillar to really focus on addiction and the intersection of stress in women's mental health. For today's event, we'll hear from 3 incredible speakers who will each give us their unique expertise and experience. We'll hold questions as we'll go straight into a panel discussion, where we'll also be joined by one of the Florey's deputy directors, who leads research in addiction research here at the Florey. And then we'll open up the floor to questions from the audience and then conclude with the opportunity to continue those discussions outside in the foyer with refreshments. So without further ado, our first speaker today will be Jenny Valentish. So wonderful to have you here, Jenny. Jenny is a journalist and author of books such as Women of Substances, A Journey into Addiction and Treatment. Jenny served as a board director of Smart Recovery Australia for 5 years and is an incredible advocate on topics including women's health, drug use and stigma. So please join me in welcoming Jenny.
Morning. Thanks so much, Jess, and also thank you, Minister. You actually beautifully foreshadowed a few points I'm going to make, so that was lovely. Let's get started. This is me, sweet 16. I turned 50 this year, and my mum dug out some photos because they were taken when she was 50. Poor mum. She would have been going through perimenopause too, but we didn't have a word for it then, which probably made it even worse. As for me, I didn't yet know that in 3 decades' time I would be lived experience lady. But if I was 16 here, I was already 3 years into rage-fueled substance use. And it's funny because we tend to think of men's substance use when we think of expressions of rage, but I was absolutely jet-powered by it. It was always there, inflating inside me like the Hindenburg awaiting a match. What is quite gendered about it is that I turned that rage inwards. Angry women don't tend to dole out king hits and coward punches. Women are more likely to self-harm. Cuts, burns, punitive methods of eating or not eating. And this all creates really complex needs if and when a woman eventually seeks treatment. With the wisdom of time, I can sum up my own case really quickly, though it seemed at the time way too complicated to present to a professional, so I didn't. Anyway, nutshell. Unhappy, uncommunicative parents, one of whom drank from morning to night. Childhood sexual abuse leading in its usual textbook way to adult sexual assault and abusive relationships. And undiagnosed this and that. But even when I figured all that out, I still had a lot of questions. When I was 34, I quit substances for 8 years. I do indulge these days, but not alarmingly. And over that 8-year period, I wanted to be an A+ student in figuring it all out. You do meet these types in AA groups. You know, everyone wants to be the best little recovering alcoholic. That was me. As part of it, I read every addiction memoir I could find. More than this is just one bit of the shelf. These books almost always followed the same pattern, though. It was a redemptive narrative of descent to rock bottom, then starting 12-step, and then a new life beginning that is dependent on absolute abstinence. I had a few problems with this. Number one, it's an overtly Christian narrative of being born again, which supports this kind of implicit idea that if you're clean now, you were dirty before. Number two, they didn't answer any of the questions I'd always wanted answered. So what's going on in the brain? What are the hereditary factors? What's going on in our lives? Why are some people more susceptible? So I started writing my own book, which came out in 2017, in order to capitalise on being a journalist and to answer those questions. Initially, this book was not going to be gendered, other than I was the main case study. But as I started interviewing people, clinicians, researchers, neuroscientists, gender actually ended up permeating every single page. Now, I suddenly had to explore, what comorbidities are women more prone to? What happens when women go undiagnosed for what until quite recently have been seen as male disorders? Why is research based around the male experience, as though women are just mini men? And why do women have more barriers to treatment? Shalini and Leigh are going to tackle some of these after me. So as someone with lived experience, here are 3 things that I think we really need to be focusing on. The hormonal connection. So there are a few things to consider here in my view. 1, there are certain times of the cycle that we're more likely to use and or relapse. The more obvious time is when we might have PMT, but another time is around ovulation when we're more inclined to take risks. Anecdotally, when I was at AA meetings, women talked about this a lot. You know, you wouldn't see it in any literature, but it was the main topic of conversation. It should be on the scrolls when you walk in. Number 2, where you are in your cycle also impacts the way in which drugs affect you. I'm not going to get too into the weeds with this, but there are papers out there, just not many. It's weird, though, that it's not more of a topic of conversation, because any GP could tell you that a woman's menstrual cycle causes fluctuations in her renal, cardiovascular, hematological, and immune systems. So it stands to reason that these fluctuations would have a knock-on effect on the way that a woman's body processes substances. Number 3, quitting alcohol abruptly instantly plunged me into a hormonal imbalance for 2 years that was chaotic and supremely unhelpful at a time when you're trying to get your stuff together. I found very few studies and absolutely no literature for the laywoman. So again, it was at this point that being around other women in recovery really, really became useful. Because again, this was a hot topic of anecdotal conversation. And number 4, I was told by several clinicians that perimenopause can reawaken early life traumas. Also, if a woman's that age, she's probably the sandwich generation where she's maybe looking after the kids, or the kids are leaving home, looking after the parents. Maybe if there's a long-term relationship, that's going to come under the microscope all of a sudden. And so it's a risky kind of age for a woman. My point really with the hormonal connection is I would love to see the research that's being done around this actually trickle down into material for clients and to GPs. Maybe services could encourage women to closely track their cycles so they know when they're about to hit a few high-risk days, particularly because if you're just emerging from a period of heavy drug use, you're very unlikely to have been in tune with your body. Quick glug of water. Number 2, adults' cumulative trauma and the need for more female-only treatment spaces. This is Ben Mendelsohn in Animal Kingdom. Like many isolated, disenfranchised girls, I gravitated towards older men in the way that rejected, isolated, disenfranchised boys have gravitated towards the IRA or ISIS. I was a willing pawn awaiting detonation. Now, this led to cumulative bad sexual experiences, from blacking out and being assaulted, to needing to be wasted to have sex because of traumatic childhood sexual experiences, to having very low social currency. As a teenager, I thought I had way more agency than I actually did. In fact, years later, when I was writing this book, clinician Jeff Corbett, who works at Meta Young Adult Healthcare in Brisbane, told me about some of his young female clients who were involved with dealers. He said, they might explain to me, well, actually, I'm exploiting them. I get all these drugs for free. And then I'm like, yes, but you're also having sex with them. Yes, but that doesn't cost me anything. Newsflash, it does cost you a lot. So these young women are likely to end up in some kind of grim Groundhog Day of being re-traumatized. Professor Jayashri Kulkarni told me, the deliberate self-harm of addictions or the self-harm of being involved in harmful relationships are all expressions of rage taken inwards and of really poor self-esteem. There's a masochistic self-fulfillment of the prophecy, I don't deserve anything good. Hence a woman gets involved with the worst kind of relationship. So in short, there's so much accumulated sexual trauma, violence, and coercion that a woman is likely to have experienced by the time she seeks treatment. And if there was ever a more motivating emotion driving substance use than shame, I'm yet to hear it. So clearly there's a need for more treatment services that are safe spaces for women to unpack all of this. And a side note, I think one of the reasons that sober coaches have started to become quite popular in the last decade is because women in particular are drawn to them because it's so hard to get into female-only services. And my last point, women are self-medicating both emotional pain and chronic pain, but the latter doesn't come up as much as a topic. The self-medicating woman is a reoccurring figure in popular culture. She's Marianne Faithfull's pill-gobbling tragedy in The Ballad of Lucy Jordan. She's the perpetually smoking, forever unfulfilled Betty Draper in Mad Men. She's mean drunk Martha in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and Kirsten in Days of Wine and Roses, who accidentally sets fire to her apartment and almost kills her child. Just as hysteria was a catch-all condition for frustrated women in Freud's day, anxiety was the buzzword from the mid-20th century onwards. But then you can see the sort of adverts that you used to get back then. You can't set her free, but you can help her feel less anxious, surrounded by brooms and vacuum cleaners. And this one for Ritalin, much the same. Maybe the best prescription would have been a more fulfilling life. But moving on to chronic pain, we don't hear so much about women self-medicating chronic pain, but conditions such as endometriosis and fibromyalgia people could be using ketamine, gummies, weeds, opioids, Valium, alcohol, and maybe things like ADHD drugs too, to break through the brain fog. In recent years, there have been a bunch of books about women's chronic pain and how it's woefully under-researched. Here you've got Pain and Prejudice by Gabrielle Jackson of The Guardian, for instance, and Jacinta Parsons from the ABC wrote Unseen. There's a couple there. and Pain Hub, that's the Facebook page for a group called Chronically Fully Sick, where everyone talks about how they're managing their usually invisible pain. So now imagine the likelihood of the woman who's self-medicating chronic pain. She's also self-medicating the accompanying anxiety and depression because she can't keep up with life. Personally, I never had chronic pain, but I did experience very flummoxed GPs. I was put on Prozac 3 times when I wasn't actually presenting with depression at all. I felt very much put in the too hard box by my GP. I can't really blame him because I got hold of my medical notes when I moved from the UK to here. And now I can see with hindsight, there was a period in my 20s where I was turning up to the doctors pretty much every 2 weeks, claiming everything from diabetes to renal failure. When really, reading between the lines, it was panic attacks, drug use, and maybe a bit of BPD. I do think that there is a lot of stigma still among health professionals towards people who take drugs, not just the public, not just the media, but also health professionals. Particularly if you think about the evil drugs, because there is a hierarchy of drugs in people's minds. I got away relatively lightly because I'm a white, middle-class, middle-aged, freelance journalist. In fact, I was a music journalist for ages, so drug taking was part of the job description. There was absolutely no fallout for me to write Women of Substances, and that's why I'm very happy to talk openly about these things, because I think those who can should. So in closing, I'd love to thank the Florey Institute for inviting me, because actually it's really made me crystallise into a few points what I think we could really be focusing our attention on when it comes to women in addiction. You can find out more about Women of Substances here if you're interested. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the next speakers. Thanks once again.
Jenny, for really sharing your stories and your voice. It's really appreciated. We'll move on to our next speaker, who will be Associate Professor Shalini Arunogiri. Let me just go to that. Shalini is a clinical addiction psychiatrist and a National Health and Medical Research Council Emerging Leader Fellow. Shalini has extensive experience working across alcohol and other drug mental health services, and her clinical research focuses on novel treatments for substance use disorders. Thanks, Shalini.
Thank you so much, Jess, and thank you to the Florey for having me here to join this panel. It's really exciting, actually, to see such a focus on this topic. It's clearly something very close to lots of our hearts. So I work at Turning Point across the Hamilton Centre and at Monash University, and my perspective that I'm hoping to bring along today is really around the clinical forefront of where we see many of the topics that have already been touched on by both the Minister and by Jenny. What does stuff look like in practice? What do our health professionals know? What do our clients see when they go in the treatment door? Just acknowledging also that the work that I'm speaking about was conducted largely on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. In terms of the kind of treatment space, and I'm speaking largely here about Victoria and Australia, but this is true for most countries internationally, this is largely a space where we're seeing change. We're seeing change in the prevalence and epidemiology of sort of trends of what women are choosing to use, and across patterns of kind of substance use, different generations as well. We're seeing sort of different generational trajectories. There's sort of divergence in terms of older generations actually consuming alcohol, women in their 40s, 50s, 60s. We're really seeing these kind of patterns where people are continuing to consume or actually increasing alcohol consumption in those generations as compared to younger generations where there's actually higher levels of abstinence, for instance, from alcohol than ever before. So there's things happening in terms of societies and how we choose to what we choose to consume. But when we think about women specifically, we need to be thinking about what's happening for women in the workplace, what's happening for women in the household, what's happening in terms of parenting, motherhood, those trajectories as well. And those societal changes have a place to bear in terms of women's mental health and also in terms of women in addiction and stress. What we do know is those changing patterns of use also have some impact on what people choose to do in terms of use and recovery and help seeking. So we've already heard the word stigma used a number of times, and we really know that stigma still has a huge impact on help seeking for anyone who lives with substance use. But we know particularly for women, there are particular challenges for women kind of coming in and talking to a health professional, or particularly walking in the door of a treatment service. For women, there are often social kind of norms that bear to play here in terms of being a good mother. For women with children, this is a significant barrier to help seeking. There's a constant kind of threat or risk of child protection being involved, for instance. So this is a real material risk for women in kind of coming and seeking care. We also know that there are many women who don't have children. And I think this is a really interesting kind of point that I hope we can kind of thread into the panel as well, because often when we talk about women's mental health and we talk about women in addiction, the question is really about motherhood, and the question is often about pregnancy. But there is a lot more to a women's lifespan than pregnancy and childbearing and child rearing. And I think there's a real richness in terms of starting to explore the impacts of sort of hormone cycles and also the impacts of sort of treatment approaches that we currently use, and understanding how that has a role to play here. So that's another theme I hope we can start to unpack a little bit more. But some of these key points are things that Leigh will continue to speak about in the next part of the talk. And just touching on the fact that there are brain and body differences for women as compared to men at every point in the addiction cycle. So from use and consumption, we know that there are differences in the body that bear to how long it takes, for instance, for substances to have a peak onset, how long it takes for them to leave the body, and then the downstream effects on your different organs. We also know that dependence and withdrawal look different for women as compared to men, including the symptoms that people experience and how long those symptoms last for. And then we also know that recovery also looks different for a whole range of different reasons. And that's not just the biological differences, but the psychological and social kind of impacts on both sort of mechanisms of recovery. In terms of comorbidities, I just want to touch on this. It's already been mentioned by Jenny in terms of both pain and trauma as well, and these are factors that I'll touch on. There are a whole range of different disorders that are experienced by women that are actually not very well understood by medical sciences, and we've already heard a little bit about women's pain, particularly in that aspect. When we say that they're not well understood by health in general, they're certainly then not understood very well by addiction treatment professionals. So when we think about those comorbidities in terms of someone presenting with, say, comorbid endometriosis, comorbid migraines, comorbid mental health problems, these are sometimes the drivers of what drove someone to develop an addiction in the first place. But we don't necessarily have clear pathways of care for those primary disorders either. So it's important to kind of understand, and I guess we already heard, from Jenny, it'd be great if someone went in to see the health professional and someone asked about your menstrual cycle. So that's not traditionally something that's asked about within the addiction treatment space either. I certainly train my registrars to ask about this, not just if you're asking about conception or pregnancy intentions. It's actually relevant across someone's lifespan. And through that as well, we're able to start to understand as well where women may be transitioning into perimenopause. Sometimes that might be the first time someone's asked them about it, and then we can start to think about care within the general practice space as well. I've touched on a whole range of different mental health disorders that we've already heard a little bit about today that also are comorbidities that have significant impact for women, and particularly in terms of, I think we haven't spoken too much about neurodivergence as well, ADHD and autism, for instance. And these are, again, mental health disorders that look different in women as compared to men. And we're only starting to kind of unpack, I think, the impact of that and when we think about stress and addiction. In terms of the treatment space, I just wanted to touch on two things that we do a lot of work on at Turning Point specifically, and this is around thinking about treatment approaches that might take into account some of these differences. So starting to think about if we work differently in this space, what could that look like? One example is thinking about biological approaches that take into account some of those hormone cycles and take into account as well the social kind of interpersonal relationships that women might have a role to play in. So one study that we've just wrapped up recently, for instance, looked at methamphetamine treatment, and we looked at methamphetamine withdrawal specifically and how that looks in women as compared to men, and started to look at the hormone kind of antecedents of this, but also what we know in methamphetamine recovery, the interpersonal relationship someone has, the social kind of network that someone has around them is critical to recovery, particularly from methamphetamine use disorder. And this is where we were starting to look at oxytocin as a potential medication for that sort of treatment approach, because we really understood that, particularly from the biological research that Leigh will touch on, this line of inquiry was much more productive in females as compared to males. So we started to think about what is it about this that it actually might lead to a productive approach for both genders that we can start to understand in women specifically. In terms of trauma and PTSD, I'll touch on this because I think it's relevant for both genders, but I think as you've heard today, there are particular trajectories for women that are really relevant. Trauma, as we all understand really, is a major risk factor for mental health problems, and it's a causative factor and a perpetuator for substance use disorders. And we know in Australian treatment settings, so with an addiction treatment across Australia, that nearly 1 in 2 people are really reporting some level of mental health symptoms related to trauma or life adversity. This is often not just in childhood, it's usually cumulative, as you've heard Jenny mention already. In terms of PTSD, we know that 3 in 4 Australians experience some form of trauma in their lifetime. So there's the majority of people in this room, for instance, or online. But only 4.5% go on to develop PTSD. So it's within the general population, it's quite a small disorder, but this is really twice as more common in women as compared to men. And when we look in addiction treatment settings, this is highly prevalent. What's important is that we know PTSD generally doesn't go away without some care or focus on it. And that we also know that substance use clearly is a really effective way to cope with the symptoms of trauma. It helps you cope with nightmares, with flashbacks, with poor sleep. It helps you cope with forming relationships with other people. So PTSD as it stands can be really difficult to form that connection with other people, those interpersonal relationships, and it can lead to withdrawal. So substance use can be a way to get over that and the initiation of that. But what we know is then people can develop problems with both the PTSD as well as the substance use itself. We know that PTSD, when it co-occurs with substance use, is debilitating, and also that the course is worsened by having both problems from a whole range of different perspectives. So the outcomes are poorer if we can't treat both problems at the same time. We've done a little bit of work in this space and started a clinic that started to treat both problems at the same time, and it's a women's only clinic. So this is one of those treatment spaces that Jenny sort of touched on that allow us to think about that whole spectrum of needs that we can kind of address. And this is, to our knowledge, the only trauma-focused integrated care clinic in Australia. It takes this type of treatment approach, COPE, which is a therapy approach that takes into account both the substance use as well as the PTSD treatment, and integrates them into a sort of 12 to 14-week psychological therapy. What's important about this type of treatment approach is it's probably been around for a couple of decades. It's been demonstrated in multi-site randomized controlled trials internationally. But really, in terms of kind of bringing that into an implementation space, in terms of bringing that to clients, it's taken over a decade. And so, some of the things that we'll hopefully talk about in the panel as well is that line of work that goes from bench to bedside and beyond. How do we actually bring things that we know work? How do we look at signals that might be working in animal research? How do we actually accelerate that? Because so much of this discovery work is already just waiting to be capitalized on. So in terms of this clinic, it's been running for 4 years now, and just wanted to touch on something that really will inform some of the work that Leigh's about to present as well. Trauma is the story in this clinic. It's why people are presenting, but 90% of people coming to this clinic have a history of family violence. This is not necessarily what people are coming into treatment for, but it's the overarching story really for women in this clinic. We know that women have had previous treatment as well, drug and alcohol treatment, so this isn't the first time that they're coming into care. For many women, the story is that they know that trauma is sitting underneath what the problem is, and they're just trying to find the right door, the right space, the right time as well to be able to work on this effectively. And for us, the work in this clinic is not easy for the women presenting. It's someone who described this clinic to me, the founder of the program, said it's a boot camp version of exercise. So you can go for a walk every day, or you can do boot camp. So it's not for everyone, but the boot camp version is curative. So it is a sort of clinical model that enables people who engage with it to be able to get remission from PTSD. And that's pretty powerful for women involved, because they can actually kind of move on with their lives. The primary drug for most women in this clinic is alcohol, as it is across many of our treatment services, but methamphetamine's a close second. And I guess just touching on something that helped us extend this clinic now, we're lucky to be part of a multi-site clinical trial where we're adding to that clinical treatment approach, we're adding psychedelic-assisted therapy. So we have MDMA-assisted therapy together with that psychotherapy model in order to be able to explore what does this allow us, what does this enable within that psychotherapy model for the people who access this clinic. And again, it's been an incredibly rewarding experience. So in summary, before I hand over to Leigh, I guess this is really the tone, and it's really about potential for discovery, about potential to discover new pathways that would work for women. But some of the hormone literature that I talked about, some of the psychotherapeutic literature, if we engage with women's stories, we're actually able to unpack what's going on for people. We actually also open up a range of approaches that could work for everyone. The hormone sort of research, the stress sort of research that we look at is enabling us to understand therapeutic approaches that work for both genders as well. So it's a really exciting way to kind of, I think, reframe and look at this space. So thank you for listening. Just thanks to the team and our supporters and our funders for being able to do this work, and I'll hand over to Leigh.
Thanks so much, Shalini, for sharing those clinical insights. There's so much to unpack there, but we need to swiftly move on to our final speaker for today, which is going to be Leigh Walker. Leigh is a National Health and Medical Research Council Emerging Leader Fellow and my fellow partner in crime, as she's the Deputy Lead for the Mental Health Research here at the Florey. Leigh's research looks at the neurobiology of alcohol use and anxiety disorders, and with a real focus on the impact of biological stress. So thanks, Leigh.
Thanks, Jess, and thank you for all coming. It's fantastic to have you here, and especially to the Minister. So I'm just going to talk a little bit now, following up on some of these themes, a little bit about what we know about the neurobiology and the kind of work that we do here at the Florey, trying to understand this. So a lot of the introduction has been covered, so I'll try to go through this quite quickly. But we know that Australians really lead the world in terms of harmful drinking. Alcohol is primarily what I focus on, but I think that this is across the board with a lot of drug use. So if we look at studies, this is from 2020, we can see that down here in Australia and New Zealand, about 85% of men are drinking at harmful levels. And this is kind of in line with a lot of European countries as well. But what's really alarming is actually the rates of alcohol, harmful alcohol use in women in Australia. So you can see on this side, that women in Australia are actually leading the way in terms of harmful drinking. And why does this matter? Well, this really matters because, one, we know that these rates are rising. So historically, men have always drunk more. They've always had higher rates of alcohol use disorders. But this gap is converging. So women are increasing at rates, which is really narrowing this gap of how many people are needing help. And we also know that there's been a disproportionate focus on male subjects. So I'll draw your attention to this, which is preclinical research. But you can see in the blue there, that's studies that are done only in males. And as we go across, we can see on this side, this is in the year 2000, through to this side, which is close to 2020, there really hasn't been that much of an increase in the way that we're actually fundamentally understanding how the woman's brain works. We also know that even though maybe about a third of clinical trials are made up of women, very few of these are actually analysed by sex to understand if these treatments can help women more effectively. And we know that also from recent meta-analyses where they take together a bunch of different studies, that some of these treatments may be, for alcohol use anyway, may be more effective or more detrimental for women based on different factors. So there's really a lot there to still discover and still to understand about how we're doing this. So we know that there's a number of different differences in alcohol use in women. Women have, higher alcohol-associated health consequences with liver damage, cardiovascular, and different types of cancer as well. And we also know that women will spiral quicker from first alcohol use through to alcohol use disorder and really harmful drinking. This is called a telescoping effect. And one thing that I really want to draw attention to is something that's been a thread throughout these talks is the reason why women are drinking. So it's not just about what we're drinking, it's about why we're drinking. And this is where substance use and alcohol use disorders become really a big problem. So women will primarily drink for more negative emotion aspects, so things like stress, anxiety, coping, shame and pain, these things that we've talked about through threads from Jenny and Shalini. Whereas it's thought that men are drinking more for positive emotion aspects, so pleasure, reward, relaxation. And so this is really important to understand because we need to not just focus on what we're drinking, but why we're drinking and the neurobiological reasons for that. And one of the big themes that has been touched on is hormones. So we know that there's two main hormones in women, estrogen and progesterone, that fluctuate throughout the lifespan. And we know that some of these fluctuations really align with critical periods of both development, but critical aspects where I guess people can be more vulnerable to poor mental health. And I won't go into too much detail here, but these being, puberty, pregnancy, and then perimenopause and menopause as well, and hopefully we'll touch a bit more on this in the discussion. And we know that there are many factors that influence alcohol use. So there are biological factors, there are social factors, and there are psychological factors as well. And yes, all of these factors can contribute, but the real problem is that these factors contribute to each other as well. So that it's really hard to think about them in unison. So this is where we come in. So we can think about these in animal models, and while we cannot model addiction as a whole, it's a very a human condition, what we can do is we can control for some of these environmental, social, or psychological factors, and then we can really probe what is the contribution of the biological factors. Including biological sex. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about just some of the research that we do here to give you a little snippet of what we do. So we know in humans we can use MRI scans to look at what parts of the brain are activated during different behaviours. We can do the same thing without the caveat of having to have someone in a scanner in rodents during their natural behaviour. So we call this CFOS, and what it is just mapping throughout the brain what parts seem to be involved in different behaviours. So in our studies, this is in binge drinking or excessive alcohol consumption. And so what we did was we mapped throughout the whole brain what parts are activated more in males or more in females. And we can see that one of the brain regions that came out for us is the amygdala. So this amygdala part of the brain is really important for that emotional processing. So it was really interesting for us to see that there was no change in male mice that didn't have alcohol or did have alcohol compared to female mice where this activation was increased. But what we can do next is we can really probe some of these mechanisms or the pathways in the brain that are involved. So what we've done is we've linked in, where does the amygdala connect to? Well, we know it connects to this part of the brain that's really important for reward processing, the nucleus accumbens. And we were able to show that this pathway in the brain is actually what is more activated in these female mice, and they had a stronger pathway. And then we can use causative measures to understand, well, if we inhibit the activity of this pathway, does it reduce alcohol consumption? And we're able to show that, yes, it does in females, but not in male mice, but it doesn't actually affect their natural rewards, so just sugar consumption. So we can really try to use the understanding from human studies through translation to our rodent studies, and then to find causative measures of how this is happening. Now what we're doing is we're actually taking this back to human post-mortem tissue, so we're very thankful to have donation from people who have passed away with alcohol use disorder. And we're able to now look very precisely at what types of genes are changing in the brain. And we can look at these based on, we've taken very much a gendered lens, so what's changing in the female brain compared to the male brain. And how can we then, work out what gene candidates might be druggable, so drugs that might be already on the market, so repurposing drugs for fast translation, or finding novel drugs that might be more beneficial for women. And we can take these back into our animal models, we can do our causative testing, understand some of the mechanisms or the possible efficacy of these drugs, and then we feed this information back into the clinic, so working closely with Shalini to understand, can we take these targets into human populations? So I've just got a couple of take-home messages in the last 2 seconds. And the one thing, if you take anything from this, is that the female brain is not just a small version of the male brain. There are multiple factors that influence the way that the female brain is organised or set up from birth through puberty, and we really need to understand it in its entirety. We need more research just in women's health generally, but primarily I think the 2 key factors that we've touched on today around stress and around hormones and how they intersect with addiction and with each other are really important as well. And we need more clinical trials and treatments, the way that Shalini's approaching this, where we think about women's biology as a centre. So not only women's biology, but a real focus on where can we distinguish and separate out what's going to be more effective for women or what's going to be more effective for men. And also listening to lived experience, especially of women, to guide women's health treatments, I think is really important as well. And so with that, I'll just say thank you to my lab members who have conducted a lot of this research and for all of your attention. And there's just some information up here where you can find support. So thank you.
All right. Thank you to all our speakers. I'm going to now invite them all to join me up on the stage here for the panel discussion. And I'd just like to welcome also Professor Andrew Lawrence, who's a leader in addiction neuroscience and heads a research group here at the Florey. Andy, maybe we can start with you because I'd like to get your thoughts. The Florey is leading major efforts in translational mental health research, focusing on women's health. What do you see as critical steps in ensuring that fundamental neuroscience discoveries start to inform clinical care and public health interventions?
Yeah, it's a critical question, and I think the 3 speakers have really demonstrated aspects of that between them collectively already. I think we're very lucky that over the years we've cultivated very strong working relationships with clinical partners, including Shalini at Turning Point and others at Turning Point, and including Yvonne Bonomo at Addiction Medicine in St Vincent's. And I can give you an example of one thing that we've done in terms of talking to what Leigh was talking about. I think our real strength here is identification and validation of new targets, and then we partner with the clinical colleagues to empirically test those. And we're very good at that. I would say we do lead the world at target identification and validation, but we depend on our clinical links to translate those. One example is a system in the brain called the orexin system, which we identified over 20 years ago now, that was critical to driving the motivation to consume alcohol and also critical in terms of precipitating relapse to alcohol seeking. And with the support of the Victorian Government from a Medical Research Accelerator Fund, we actually did a pilot test in treatment-seeking people with alcohol use disorder, and we transformed the life of somebody. And fortunately, we're in a position now to actually do a second trial with Shalini at Turning Point and with a second site in Sydney to go beyond that pilot study to really test it at a larger scale in an outpatient setting to hopefully pave the way for a much broader, fully scaled clinical trial in the future. That's just one example of how we can go from a very basic discovery all the way through to changing people's lives. And at the end of the day, we want to change people's lives. The problem with that is it's a very slow process. That's a 20-year window. And so what we really need is a lot of the targets that we do identify and validate have treatments or medications that are available already that interact with those targets, but they're approved and registered for other disorders. And so what we really need is a system that supports and enables that very rapid proof of concept testing in humans, in a human laboratory experiment scenario, that can tick the box as to whether our animal studies are taking us down the right path and giving us more candidates that we could put out for clinical trials. And I could give you a list as long as my arm of candidates like that. And the problem that we have is doing it within time and having a facility that we can use for that purpose. I think that's critical.
It's a really important point, isn't it? There's so much potential, it's just about time. So Shalini, can I just get your thoughts very quickly, extending that from a clinical perspective, because I think time is important. How do we, rapidly integrate some of these research findings? This is what we're talking about. How do we take these incredible findings and make them, more accessible in terms of frontline clinical care?
Yeah, I think one of the most important ways is things like this. I think just bringing together the clinical and animal research partners and also engaging with community around what's actually going to be feasible, what's going to be viable. But it's in these cross conversations, and then also we've slowly gotten better, I think, over time at understanding how also to collaborate in a way that attracts research funding. I think that second part is very tricky, not just for us here in Australia, which has a narrow kind of window, but I think just internationally as well, understanding how to make that work in a way that we can actually test ideas, because as Sandy's mentioning, it's really about being able to quickly test these ideas and then bring that to the front line. And some of the programs that we've got access to now enabled us to do that and hear back as well from clients in the front line in terms of in clinical trials, getting feedback in terms of feasibility, in terms of targets actually being helpful, unhelpful, so we can quickly then go back to the drawing board and think, how do we do this differently?
So it's continuing to sort of synergise and strengthen those sort of broader partnerships, really, isn't it? Jenny, I want to come to you. Thank you so much for sharing your story. I'd like to get your thought on what's one misconception about women and addiction you wish the public better understood?
I think women who are using ice are particularly demonised and misunderstood. And when I think about that cohort, if you like, I think about that phrase, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, because often people might start using a stimulant to try and get everything done, to be able to look after the kids, to be able to work. And that was a pathway that I was hearing about quite a lot when I was writing the book. And nobody intends to get addicted to a drug. So, if you think about, of the slides that I showed earlier, there was one for Ritalin from 1970, and it was being prescribed to women as a stimulant to get more done. So, same kind of context, but different labels. So I think, the media's done an excellent job of really demonising ice and calling it evil at every opportunity, and people who use it evil. So that's a real challenge to sort of tackle that stigma around that drug in particular.
Really, really, really important. I'm going to touch on this because I think we talked a lot about hormones. I think everyone touched on it. As you know, I share this very openly as somebody who is going through perimenopause. I think it's something, I love the fact that we're talking about it openly now. Leigh, let me ask you, you touched a little bit on the life stages. Are there, in your thoughts, what's known through research, are there particularly biologically, vulnerable eras or stages for women that impact sort of stress and addiction?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's obviously a key theme coming through all of the conversations that we're having today. So there's really 3 life stages that are really critical. In terms of the stress response and vulnerability to addiction. So puberty being one, and pregnancy. So, in puberty, if we go back to it, we know that, girls going through puberty have higher rates of diagnoses of anxiety disorders. And something that I'll touch on that was actually in Jenny's book, which I've been enjoying reading over the last few weeks, was also about, the advertising of Alco Pops to these, younger girls as, a beverage that's not going to taste bad, and a leg opener. And all of these aspects whereby, not only are they vulnerable in terms of the hormone fluctuations that they're going through, their body changes, but also the advertising that has historically been directed at them. We also know that pregnancy is a big one in terms of postpartum depression. So after pregnancy, you have this hormone spike and then you have this drop. Estimates are that 1 in 5 women will have postpartum depression shortly after giving birth. And then the final one, which we know a lot less about, is perimenopause and menopause. So it's thought to be about a 40% increased risk factor for depression during this time. But a lot of the research has not really delved into how that's working. So yeah, lots of critical periods for both stress and obviously these comorbidities that are leading to alcohol use. And I think that Jenny covered it really well in terms of, you know, when we have these peaks within our cycle alone, you know, for naturally cycling women. But one thing that has really not got the emphasis that needs to be is also contraceptive pills. So, you know, women, for a large part of their reproductive life, right through from adolescence, can be taking high levels of hormones, and we don't know how they interact with potential treatments or how they alone are actually driving, you know, alcohol use or anxiety, depression disorders as well.
And maybe I'll throw to a question that I have for all of you, and then we'll go to the audience, which is, I know that Victoria is currently in a transformative phase for mental health reform. How do we better integrate all the things that we've discussed today about the evidence, the research, and policy decisions to make a difference in the prevention space? How do we prevent, get into early intervention and tailor treatments? I'm wondering if you could make a comment on how we make an impact in women's health in Victoria.
Sure, I can have a stab at that from my perspective. I've been working with Shalini on another thing as well in terms of developing guidelines for the safe prescription of MDMA for PTSD, and that was touched on the empathy trial that is part of our Synergy grant as well. And so we've grouped together, a group of us in Victoria and interstate as well, have put together some guidelines that will be adopted by the NHMRC for the safe use and the recommendations about when or when not to prescribe MDMA for PTSD that included all stakeholders. And I think that's the critical thing, is you've got to keep all stakeholders in the conversation, not just clinicians and not just scientific experts, but also lived experience and living experience. And we've done that. So that's just come out of public consultation, and we're now responding to the public comments. I think that's critical. Within a Victorian perspective, I think the Minister mentioned the Alcohol and Other Drugs Task Force, and I've been at a number of those meetings and meeting on a regular basis with Paul McCartney, not the member of the Beatles, Paul McCartney, a doctor from Safer Care Victoria, and Dean Membry and their team, in terms of providing them, because they're very proactive in terms of being open to using off-label medications, which is what I mean from that is medications that are approved to treat a different disorder, but to use it for a drug and alcohol condition. And so I've been meeting with them and giving them some advice about things that they could consider to increase their tool bag of things that they could prescribe to their clients.
Mm-hmm. Jenny, your thoughts?
Yeah, I wouldn't be as up-to-date as the rest of the panel, but one thing I did notice when writing the book, which was really alarming, was how people who have eating disorders and substance use issues could really fall between the cracks because the services are quite siloed and complex. So, you know, if you needed, say, to be on a feeding tube, you're not going to be able to go to a detox or a rehab. And you probably wouldn't be admitted to an eating disorder ward if you were still actively taking drugs. So that was a huge problem at the time. I don't know if that's improved at all lately.
Shalini? Has it improved?
I would hope it has improved a little bit, but it's 2017. But I think, I mean, building on that point, I think one of the critical parts of sort of ensuring impact and amplifying it, as well as engaging with the workforce, and I think the training, the ensuring that health professionals and systems kind of understand even some of the research that's already available. So it's actually kind of, you know, working on that implementation and translation from, I mentioned the treatment clinic that we run. We took it off the shelf. It was, you know, available that book was available for over a decade before we actually started the clinic. And so, it takes that translation step is really impactful, because it allows us to be able to actually use stuff that's already available out there, but sometimes adapt it, sometimes actually make sure it's right for the population that we're trying to reach. But then actually being able to train clinicians, build that capacity across the system so people are actually able to engage with that work as well.
Yeah. And Leigh, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that it's something that was touched on a little bit across, is also this collection of women's data when they are coming in, and being able to take things like hormones, contraceptives, where they are in their cycle, and being able to integrate that in. So thinking about policy, it would be about understanding those factors which are going to potentially lead to prevention, because we're going to be able to understand some of those factors driving things. I also think there have been some strides made in the last couple of years with NHMRC around guidelines of increasing the use of both sexes of animals in preclinical research, where our fundamental understanding is coming from to drive a lot of these treatments. But I think there can be a bigger push there as well around implementing those aspects as to why you're using, if you're only using one sex, why. Yeah.
Now, I appreciate that we've gone slightly over time, but I just want to throw the floor open to some audience questions, maybe some burning questions. I think we've got one over there.
Thank you very much. For evolutionary reasons, females have higher neuroticism than males, and I think fundamental reason for many of the ills, mental health problems in both sexes is due to high neuroticism. My question is, has there been any studies to investigate if the difference between males and females in neuroticism trait has it been increasing or narrowing in the last 20 years or so? Thank you.
Shalini, do you want to take that question?
Sure. I guess in terms of, I'm not familiar with neuroticism specifically being mapped, but certainly in terms of expressions of neuroticism, in terms of anxiety disorders, I think we're better at understanding the expression of that in males as compared to females. And the expression of that is quite divergent and quite different, as we'd understand. I suppose in relation to whether that's been narrowing, I'm not sure that it necessarily has. I think some of these kind of prevalence, Andy can probably build on this as well, but I think the prevalence data around this has been relatively stable in most countries, but I guess expression is also impacted on by social norms and societal norms in terms of how that's understood, and that, that is culturally dependent, I think, as well.
Okay. Well, maybe in the interest of time, I could just get you all to join me in thanking all our speakers for sharing their important insights today. I know we've only just scratched the surface of some of the important themes that have arisen today, but I do hope that we all flow outside and continue the conversations. I just want to flag some really important themes that have really surfaced today: how hormonal changes across the life stages interact with stress and addiction vulnerability, the gendered stigma and barriers to treatment for women with addiction disorders, the real need for mechanistic neuroscience research in both women and men, how lived experience can inform more gender-sensitive interventions and clinical practice changes, and importantly, the work that we all have ahead of us to collectively drive the changes we want to see in policy, in funding, in health services, and access to that integrated mental health care that the Minister spoke about. So let's keep talking, and please join us outside to continue the discussions over refreshments. Thanks, everyone.